each not to exceed 7 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, in places like the place we're at now, sex tourism is a big thing. We all know this, we're all very aware of it, especially in the venue we're in at the moment. But there are serious problems with sex tourism in the developing world, and these are problems that the government side wants to address. And there are three particular problems that we're concerned about with sex tourism in Thailand and places like Thailand at the moment. The first one is that it's very unsafe to be a prostitute. There's a strong potential for exploitation. Children are involved in the industry. So there are serious safety and empowerment concerns with prostitutes in places like Thailand, caused by a complete government denial of the existence of this problem and of this industry. The second problem we see is that the government is denying an opportunity and a legitimate avenue out of poverty by not embracing this industry, by not providing the protections that are prevalent in other places. And the third thing we see is that this is restrictive of liberty. So what are we going to do? Well, the first thing we're going to do, obviously, is legalise prostitution for those above 18. But secondly, primarily what we want to do is invest in those authorities and those enforcement mechanisms that are present in places like the Netherlands, places like New Zealand, where prostitution is legal. And so what kind of investment are we actually talking about today? Well, we're talking about things like investing in sexual health clinics that provide places for prostitutes to go if they feel they're in danger or if they want information about disease or contraception or anything else. We're going to provide things like contraception for prostitutes. We're going to pay for police units that specialise in this industry to protect prostitutes and protect that industry. And we're going to provide the means for prostitutes to enforce their legal rights through those clinics, through those enforcement agencies, and we're also, by the way, going to set up licensing agencies. So, for example, it is only legal to work within a licensed institution. This allows governments to enforce that kind of oversight. I'm still sitting up, no thank you, in the industry. So basically the model today, ladies and gentlemen, is that we're going to invest in those agencies, those enforcement mechanisms, those sexual health programs that are prevalent in places like the Netherlands and places like New Zealand. So why do we want to do this? Well, the first reason we want to do this is that we think that this makes it safer for prostitutes themselves and safer for those sex tourists. The second reason we say is that this provides a legitimate avenue out of poverty for many people, and the government has a responsibility, and especially in development, to provide pathways out of poverty. We think this is a legitimate pathway. And the third thing is that we remove a restriction on liberty, which is what Jordan's talking about. Decline. Thank you. So this first issue of safety, I've already explained a lot of this issue in the sense that I've given you many of the examples or many of the agencies and programs that are prevalent in places like New Zealand that allow prostitutes to seek help if they are in danger, to seek information about disease, to seek contraceptive advice. Because at the moment we see that the government officially denies the prevalence of this industry, and so officially denies any protection to a prostitute. If a prostitute wants to seek help from the police, they cannot, because they feel the stigma of criminalisation, ladies and gentlemen. They don't seek help because they are afraid of the consequences of admitting into their activity. We see many children involved in this practice because there is no official police action or police involvement in protecting those people. Serious problems like that. Yes, ma'am.
When you talk about the fact that this is actually a tourism industry and the market lies in bad practice of sex, not about the practice of industry, how does your model actually protect women, protect children?
Well, this gets me on to the second aspect of the switch point, which is that we strongly believe that the majority of sex tourists actually do want a legal, non-exploitative experience. We think they will go through legal channels to licensed institutions. And it's not as if they need to save a great deal of money, ladies and gentlemen. these tourists have money. They will go to safer, licensed institutions if they can. They don't want to go and have sex with under 18 people, ladies and gentlemen, to leave it. If for no other reason, then there is a strong deterrent. And if they can point to 1 out of 10,000 sex tourists who can do that, I'm afraid that's not enough, opposition bench, because we strongly believe the reason why sex tourists come here is mainly for sex that they can't get at home. And we think that there is no reason to believe that there is a stronger proportion or a higher proportion of people that want to engage in exploitative practices than there would be at home. Decline, sir. And so we say these kinds of programs will make prostitutes safer, and we think these would actually work in the sense that sex tourists would seek out these avenues, seek out these licensed institutions, because they are afraid of consequences if they do not, and they do not want to engage in exploitative behaviour if they do not want it.
Sir?
And the second thing I want to get onto is that do we think this is a legitimate pathway out of poverty? Because what we say on the government side today is that governments, especially in the developing world, have a responsibility to provide as many pathways out of poverty as they can. We all recognise the great prevalence of poverty and desperation in places like we are today. And we say governments around the world have, as part of their duty to their citizens, as part of the social contract, to provide an avenue out of that. Yes, Joe?
Can you explain, sir, why, given the institution of a program in Thailand to require prostitutes to carry ID cards and submit to health checks, there was no demonstrable change to the reporting of sex tourism for underage persons?
That program, ladies and gentlemen, was a half-hearted, hackneyed approach that wasn't given basically any resources for investment at all. And if that's going to be what they're saying is sort of a satisfactory alternative, that's just wrong. What we propose are the kind of programs that are in places like New Zealand and Australia, places like New Zealand and the Netherlands, where you actually put the resources into those enforcement mechanisms. You pay for the distribution of condoms, you pay for all those other things, and you require these people to work through licensed institutions. Something that the hackneyed approach that was taken a couple of years ago never even attempted. And so to quickly get back to the actual point I was making, we think the government has a responsibility, and we think this is a valid one, because we don't think prostitution is inherently exploitative. We see no real difference between working as a prostitute and working 16-hour days for minimum wage days. In terms of the exploitation, we say a 16-hour day is a lot worse, because at least as a prostitute, you actually get to spend more time with your family, you get to control your own body and your own resources in a way that you never do working in a sweatshop or anything like that. And so we see at the moment that the exploitation comes through lack of protection, through lack of avenues to seek help. And we say providing those avenues to seek help and that funding enables prostitutes to work in a non-exploitative environment. And for those two reasons, ladies and gentlemen, we can improve the safety and health of prostitutes, and secondly, that we're at the moment denying a valid avenue out of poverty, we strongly stand in proposition.
I thank the Prime Minister for his speech, and I invite the Leader of the Opposition to begin the case for opposition benches.
Mr. Speaker, what James has said to us today is that you can develop a positive industry for sex in a developing country through investment by the government in that sex tourism industry. What he didn't do was talk to us about why tourism is the particular way in which you develop good practice in sex industries. He didn't talk to us about why the developing countries of this world are the same as developed nations such as New Zealand and yes, Australia and the Netherlands. He didn't explain how this would actually be effective. What he did tell us was there was very little political will, that the government made half-hearted attempts, but somehow suggested they would implement the model that was presented by the government bench wholeheartedly, that there was some kind of impetus in communities to create this change. He also suggested to us that although people from overseas come to Thailand for certain levels of sex tourism that may not be palatable to them to law enforcement in their home countries, that this isn't the kind of market that exists for tourists to come to Pattaya, ladies and gentlemen. So what we see on the government bench thus far is a miscomprehension of the market itself and a miscomprehension of the role of tourism in development. What we on the opposition bench say is that it is never okay for a government to send the message that sex is the way for communities to develop. Sex is the way for the actual people of a society and community to develop their nation, to get their rights at work, to get the kind of existence in their communities that's positive to the development of that nation, those individuals. We don't think the model presented from the government bench empowers anybody. We think it actually pushes, if it were to be effective, would actually push the kind of market that exists for sex tourism underground and remove it from regulation full stop. What we say, ladies and gentlemen, is that this sends a very bad message to people that are already being exploited in the industry, and it doesn't develop strong notions of gender, identity and respect for individuals in these communities. So in the first motion of rebuttal, I want to quickly look at is this whole idea of agencies of enforcement and the half-hearted approach that the government bench says currently takes place. The second I want to look at is why industry is different to tourism. So when we look at the agencies of enforcement, we think that the government bench hasn't shown us the capacity, both in political will, in funding, in implementation, to deliver this model. And we don't think it actually specifically targets tourism as the motion inherently suggested, the notion of actually investing in the development of tourism itself. What they've done is invest in regulation, ladies and gentlemen, and what we're going to talk about in this debate itself is how that doesn't specifically apply to tourism itself. We also don't think that regulation has to be mutually exclusive to tourism. We think regulation over time can be a good thing. We think positive regulation can actually develop certain positive roles in society, but we don't think that their case does anything about encouraging positive sex tourism, ladies and gentlemen. This notion of the industry versus tourism itself, we think that when they talk about liberty and choice on one breath, and exploitation in the other, they're not analysing how the market and the role of sex tourism in these nations actually automatically leads to a reduction in liberty and choice. And they're not solving exploitation in their case. Because what I asked in my POI was that the market is for misuse. The market that currently exists is for bad practice, ladies and gentlemen. And what the government bench has done has failed to deal with that kind of market itself, because we don't think it's going to go away by just introducing regulation. They say that Westerners don't want to be attacked in Thailand for going against the law and misusing and misappropriating regulation. And we say that political capital they suggested should exist, it doesn't exist, is a problem. When you have stamped on your visa card in Singapore that you're going to be executed for drug trafficking, ladies and gentlemen, that's not going to be stamped on your entry card in Thailand, ladies and gentlemen, because they told us the government's never going to have the political will to introduce it. So ladies and gentlemen, what I'm talking about in my substantive is this notion, firstly, of the role of tourism in development, because I think it's pretty problematic for the government bench to just tell us that we're going to invest in sex industries, ladies and gentlemen. And the second thing I'm going to talk about is the role of government policy sending these kinds of messages. I'll take you in a second. So I'm going to talk in this way about society, and what Thomas is going to do in Deputy Opposition Leader is talk about individuals. That's the actual impact of exploitation on individuals themselves, and things like trafficking of children. Chris?
Firstly, we would suggest that not all sex tourists in Thailand are Gary Glitter. But secondly, if there is a problem of misuse, isn't the best way to regulate that to work out which bits of it you don't want and which bits you want to keep?
Okay, what we say is you're not making that congruous with the status quo, with the capacity of governments to regulate and with the political will, as I said. And the problem with that is when you say what you don't like, you don't actually stop it from existing in the market. You don't stop it from existing, and you don't protect the people that are further exploited by being pushed into that. We say that what you do is create this fluffy, kind of covering, legitimate kind of notion of let's just go have sex. And then you have the kind of market being pushed underground where people pull razor blades out of their bodies, ladies and gentlemen, because that's the market that exists in this country. So what we have a look at, ladies and gentlemen, is this firstly the role of tourism in development. And what we say is that when a government is investing in some way in developing the tourist industry, it has to be sustainable. It has to develop good practice, which represents the rights of individuals. It has to represent things like cultural identity and the capacity of people to have a say in the way in which they present their society to the world, ladies and gentlemen. Because that's the only way you get engagement in actually developing certain regions. When you rely on exploitation, when you rely on these kinds of precepts, then you don't get good development of tourism practice in countries. And when we see the fact that that industries can be very reliant on tourism, ladies and gentlemen, what the government bench wants to do is push it underground and remove it from government oversight, remove it from protections, remove it from the capacity for the government to gain political capital or to gain economic incentive by in the future looking at positive practices. Sure.
No, at the moment it's underground. That's the problem.
It's
That's
not
why
underground.
we invest in the
It's not
programs
underground.
to bring it
When you go down to Pat Pond markets and you've got super pussy on every street, ladies and gentlemen, It is not underground. When you have the development of markets and the development of restaurants and industries and hotels and businesses around a very well-known, internationally known market, ladies and gentlemen, then what we say in this case is that's the market that exists, and your regulation's never going to take that market away, ladies and gentlemen, because you haven't shown the capacity of the government to do so. You haven't shown the capacity and the will of the people to do so, ladies and gentlemen. So when we have a look at the notion of this second point, the idea of government policy, why do we say it's never okay for a government to build up tourism, ladies and gentlemen, tourism, because that's what's missing from the government's case so far, the idea of selling sex tourism to the world, which they haven't done. Why is it never okay for the government to rely on sex tourism as an industry? And what we say here is that this can't be an avenue out of poverty. You can't suggest to people that you should sell your body in an exploitative sense to get an avenue out of poverty. We say, ladies and gentlemen, that the government should invest in things that are inherently in the public good, and we don't think sex tourism is ever going to do that, ladies and gentlemen. What we think is that New Zealand and the Netherlands and Australia are very different to Thailand. They have the structures, they have the capacities to implement these kinds of models. And we don't think that this is going to be effective in a nation such as Thailand. That's why we're very proud to oppose.
I thank the leader for her speech and invite the Deputy Prime Minister to continue the case.
Ladies and gentlemen, apparently our proposal to invest in sex tourism wasn't quite sex tourism enough for the opposition side of the House today, ladies and gentlemen. We think legalising sex tourism, we think actually investing in the mechanisms which allow sex tourism to function broadly constitutes investing in some pretty meaningful ways in the area of sex tourism. I'm not too sure if they wanted us to screen ads on BBC for it or something, ladies and gentlemen, but we think the proposal that we've got on this side of the House is pretty solid for investing in sex tourism. Secondly, ladies and gentlemen, this idea that there just isn't apparently enough political will, well, we think that's pretty much what this whole debate is about, whether or not it's a sensible proposal, ladies and gentlemen. So I now want to move on to the three key points I'm going to make today. And the first point I want to make is that we get a better sex industry out of adopting these kinds of reforms. The second point I want to make is that we think this is a really important pathway out of poverty and build on what my first speaker said. And the third point I want to make is that we think that people actually should have the capacity to engage in these kind of contracts if that's what they choose to do. And we think that people have that people, consenting adults just should be allowed to do these things, decline. So firstly, this idea of cleaning up the industry, ladies and gentlemen. And we have three key points about why we think we get a better sex tourism industry. Firstly is this idea of empowerment of prostitutes. Secondly, this idea because we think we provide a mechanism for sex tourists to engage in better sex tourism. And thirdly, the point that I want to develop on is this idea that actually once you create a licensed industry above board, we think that's really helpful for helping regulate the stuff below ground, ladies and gentlemen, because we think good, reputable sex industry, outfits don't want these other types there, and they're happy to dob them in police because these are the people with the connections and the know-how, and so we think we get a bit of self-regulation in the industry decline. So firstly, this idea about we're actually going to that we're going to empower prostitutes. And it was a really flippant point of information by the closing opposition that, well, because apparently the government asked them to have ID cards and go to health checks, there's nothing really more we can do to clean it up. We say, ladies and gentlemen, provided something is illegal, provided that Thai police continue to do sporadic raids and actually arrest people and put people into jail for these practices, there really is massive disincentives for actually going to health clinics. So firstly, we think we actually provide them with number one, a level of information, access to contraception, etc., etc. Secondly, we just think we do have various legal rights and protections which they're not granted at the moment. And while legal systems in the developing world aren't great, we think in countries like Thailand, actually, yes, there is capacity to take people to court and to prosecute, and for prostitutes to be awarded various kinds of legal rights and protections, which they simply are not at the moment and cannot without prostitution being legalised. The second key point, though, is this idea that by and large we think that one of the key mechanisms that our proposal actually has positive impacts is through tourists from overseas choosing to go to licensed institutions, and it was just a gross mischaracterization of who typically goes to the developing world for sex tourism, ladies and gentlemen. It's by and large, ladies and gentlemen, it's by and large Australian people on stand parties, ladies and gentlemen. It's by and large people who aren't getting enough at home, ladies and gentlemen. It's not, ladies and gentlemen, hordes of paedophiles, ladies and gentlemen. It's not, ladies and gentlemen, hordes of people after what do we hear from the opening opposition? Razor blades popping out of people. Ladies and gentlemen, this is not by and large why people go there. They're by and large after actually legal kind of sexual behaviour. And ladies and gentlemen, these are not people who are wanting to amass a criminal record in the process. So we say there is a massive incentive for these people to actually go to these kind of licensed institutions. And ladies and gentlemen, given that so much stuff happens underground and all the nasty child stuff happens underground, we says this provides them with a channel to say, if I want to engage in safe stuff, if I want to engage in stuff which is respectful of people, this is where I go and I can engage in good stuff, and that way we actually starve the nasty stuff of their clientele base. Thirdly, ladies and gentlemen, we think that once we create a licensed industry, there's actually a really big incentive on them to crack down on the other nasty things, because we say that that's what industries do. That by and large, we have a few people in control of all of a lot of things. And ladies and gentlemen, firstly, because of the general perception of the industry, it's to their benefit to actually promote their area as like a decent area of sex tourism, where okay things happen and where you're not going to be arrested for having sex with a child prostitute. And secondly, ladies and gentlemen, we think that for their long-term profitability, etc., that's just a sensible thing to do. And we certainly see it happening in other industries decline. My second point, though, today is this idea of a pathway out of poverty. And it was a really funny, it was interesting to hear what the leader of the opposition had to say on this. And she said, well, it's never okay for the government to send a message that it's okay to have sex for employment, ladies and gentlemen, in the developing world. And we say that's really wrong. Apparently it is okay for the government to send a message that it's okay to be unemployed and live in poverty, ladies and gentlemen. Apparently it is okay for the government to send a message that you can work in manufacturing industries for 12 hours a day. Yes, Joe?
Can you tell me how prostitutes in the developed world are empowered and able to move on to different careers given the attitudes that society has about them?
In the developed world, well, we think that there are various mechanisms in the developed world. We'd like to restrict this to the developing world, and I can provide you lots of ways that this happens, and that's what I'm going to be going on to right now, actually, ladies and gentlemen. But ladies and gentlemen, this idea that simply because something is, the idea simply because they don't morally like this, doesn't mean that it's not okay. And we say that when you have people living in desperate poverty, ladies and gentlemen, either in unemployment or in very low paid other work, we don't see what's so abhorrent about people engaging in the sex industry, especially when it provides them for getting an option out of poverty, ladies and gentlemen. Thirdly, this idea that people actually have the capacity to consent. And it's interesting that they raise this idea of gender identity, because we think one of the really good ways that you can enhance women's rights is by actually maybe giving them an income, ladies and gentlemen, and actually allowing them to support themselves and to support their families. And this is exactly what prostitution tends to do. And if they want pathways out of poverty, ladies and gentlemen, if they want pathways beyond prostitution, we say, why don't you actually take some of the most destitute people there are living in poverty, who have the necessary skills and attributes to be able to participate in this industry, and actually get some money, ladies and gentlemen. Actually get some money. And we think that if you want pathways out of poverty, money is a really good way to start. And we think once you have a legitimate industry, it actually allows people to move out of it, ladies and gentlemen. Unlike the current status quo, where they get caught by their pimps, where they get caught by nasty situations. Let's have a system where people can go to this industry, make some money, use it for their children's education, use it for their own health and education, ladies and gentlemen, and progress. And so, ladies and gentlemen, because we do provide mechanisms for creating a better sex industry, because we do provide pathways out of poverty, and because we firmly defend the rights of people to engage in consensual sexual relationships, we proudly beg to support this measure.
Speech and invite the deputy leader to continue the case for the opposition.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to be getting right into it. In my substantive matter, I'm going to be looking more at the impact this is actually going to have on the individuals currently in the sex industry. Because it's all well and good for the government to say not everyone who comes to Thailand is Gary Glitter, but what we say is that the amount of women who are engaged in the exploitative part of the sex industry, who are engaged in the part of the sex industry which is focused on the activities that we really want to minimise, is huge, ladies and gentlemen. And furthermore, what we say is when you encourage government over-regulation, you push all of these people completely out of the corner, ladies and gentlemen. We'd say you not only discourage any ability of the government to regulate to protect these women, but more importantly, you discourage the activities of NGOs to protect these women, because in the status quo, ladies and gentlemen, that's who we would say is the only organisation protecting women from being exploited in the sex industry. So moving on to my rebuttal, ladies and gentlemen, I want to look at two ideas. Firstly, this sort of fantasy of having a specialised sex police going around patrolling the sex industry in Thailand. And second of all, looking at the development of the tourism market over time as opposed to simply the individual sex workers. So first of all, looking at this idea of regulation breeds transparency, whatnot, I think the big furphy put out by the government was simply that they were trying to develop a first world sex industry in a third world country, and we'd say you cannot do that, ladies and gentlemen. When we look at the reasons why sex workers in Thailand, why sex workers in developing countries don't go to the police, it's not just the fact that it's an illegal industry, ladies and gentlemen. It's the fact that they belong to people who will beat them if they go to the police. It's the fact that they're being told repeatedly that they will be beaten by the police if they go to the police. The fact that there is no means of actually understanding. The fact that there is widespread corruption among the police. We say the government model does nothing to remove any corruption, ladies and gentlemen. We say it's not going to get rid of the gangs. It's not going to get rid of organised crime. It's just going to legitimise ties between the police and those gangs, because the industry in which they are involved in is now legal. We'd say that's the only way we can currently catch exploitative sex workers, ladies and gentlemen. Not the fact that they engage in child prostitution, but the fact that they are engaged in the sex industry, because it is simply too difficult to prove otherwise. So second of all, ladies and gentlemen, the idea of how this is really investment in the sex industry, ladies and gentlemen. What we'd say is that no, it's investment in regulation. We'd say that it's investment in police enforcement, and quite frankly, we'd say investment in police enforcement in general is what you should be doing in a country. If you want to strengthen a country, a third world country, then you invest in the ability of that country to regulate and enforce its laws as a whole. You don't just go around and create some sex police and pretend the rest of the system's okay. More importantly, ladies and gentlemen, we'd say it's a bit of a furphy to say that we can effectively regulate tourists, because if we look at the status quo, ladies and gentlemen, we'd say tourists have a very different experience with regard to engagement in the legal system in third world countries, ladies and gentlemen. We'd say the mere fact that third world countries rely on tourism for so much of their income, particularly countries which rely on the sex industry whatsoever, we'd say that creates an enormous moral hazard on the ability of the police to actually, I will take you in a minute, the ability of the police to actually monitor. Yes?
So doesn't that very economic dependence make regulating the bits of the sex industry you don't like functionally impossible, because you can't regulate the entire industry?
No, what we'd say is you can regulate the entire industry if you actually invest, which is what we'd say should be done. What we're moreover saying is that if you simply legitimise the entire industry, you make it virtually impossible to catch the areas of that industry that we want to target, ladies and gentlemen. Because what we say is that most of the current regulation, most of the current monitoring is done by NGOs. Most of the catches are made by NGOs who represent, and organisations representing other countries, ladies and gentlemen. What we say is if you legitimise the service providers in that industry, you make it incredibly difficult for those NGOs to go around and actually gather evidence about the exploitative behaviour of women. We look to the example of how gambling was legalised in Macau, ladies and gentlemen. We'd say organised crime hasn't gone down, gang-related killings hasn't gone down, because simple legalisation, simply having regulation, does not actually mean you get effective enforcement of regulation. It doesn't mean you remove corruption in third world countries, ladies and gentlemen. That's the fantasy the government tried to put on you. So second of all, looking at the idea of the gradual development of the tourism industry, because we'd say this isn't about just whether or not sex workers as individuals should be allowed to take this path. We'd say the issue about whether or not the government should invest in the tourism industry is about more broadly the development of tourism in third world countries, which is an issue they haven't really decided to engage with. And what we'd say there, ladies and gentlemen, is if you're looking at the public development of tourism as an industry, because we'd say a country's tourist industry is very public because of the promotions to other countries, ladies and gentlemen. we'd say that not only is it harmful to a country's legitimacy when it legalises an industry which so far has caused so much suffering within a country, which has been the cause of so much exploitation, but moreover, it decreases the size of potential markets when that country says, yes, this industry is okay by our standards, ladies and gentlemen. Yes, this is the kind of industry we want to see, to develop Thailand's future, ladies and gentlemen. We'd say, Australia is hosting World Catholic Youth Day next year. We'd say the Pope is not going to consider hosting World Catholic Youth Day in a country which legitimises and invests in the sex industry to that extent. So third of all, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to move on to my substantive matter, because what we'd say, ladies and gentlemen, is if you look at these countries, there are enormous difficulties already inherent in the system regarding the role of women in the society, regarding general exploitation. What we'd say is if you legitimise the sex industry, it does two things. First of all, it forces all the women who are currently engaged in the parts of the enormous parts of the sex industry we don't like, completely underground, because it legitimises the engagement between sex workers, sex work providers and police, ladies and gentlemen. It makes it much more difficult to actually catch corruption, to actually regulate the system. So what we'd say is it may be well and good for the wealthy independent providers who only go after Saudi princes and aren't actually ever exploited. But it's not good for the type of people we actually want to protect. But second of all, what we'd say is it makes life incredibly difficult for the NGOs because it's so hard already. It's so hard to tell between providers of different legitimacy, ladies and gentlemen, to tell who's actually engaging in exploitative practices. We'd say the fact that Al Capone couldn't even be caught for racketeering, the fact that he had to be brought up on tax evasion charges, ladies and gentlemen, we'd say having an illegal sex industry is the only way you currently catch providers who actually engage in exploitative practices in the industry. By legitimising the entire industry, it may have some benefits for the very small number of providers who aren't currently hurt under the status quo, but when we're looking at the people we're trying to protect, when we're looking at the people who are exploited, it's a very bad situation, and that's why we're proud to oppose.
I thank the Deputy Leader and invite the Member of the Government to begin the case for closing arguments.
Thank you.
Mr. Speaker, while I'm sure that Milton Friedman, Friedrich Hayek and Ayn Rand would all agree with the opening opposition that any government regulation is better done by the private sector, in today's debate, we fundamentally have a problem with that particular line, because we would suggest that the very regulatory lack of capacity of governments to deal with the sex industry and to deal with the problems of the sex industry is completely undermined by the fact that in these countries they have to maintain the facade that that industry is an illegal one. We think it's detrimental in three clear respects. Firstly, we think it undermines the status of women in these societies. Secondly, we say that a system such as that embraced by the opening government and proposed in this debate actually enhances the institutional capacity of government both to deal with the problem, but more generally. And thirdly, we would say it's in the long-term economic interests of these countries to pursue policies which create any development that brings them out of poverty. But before I get on to explaining those particular points, we need to analyse what we heard from the opening opposition. The first thing they wanted to suggest was that somehow that the regulation would actually be more difficult if you legalised it. We would suggest there's a couple of factors that make that specifically problematic for them. Firstly, the fact that prostitution is illegal in these countries is the single biggest barrier to the enforcement of, say, legal rights for these people. And if you look at the problem of, say, rape in the prostitution profession, the single biggest problem in the prostitution profession being rape, that when it's actually not legal for them to be prostitutes in the first place, to be having sex with any people, that these people never even go to the police to report it, but more importantly, can never even get involved in legal proceedings against the people that raped them. So when it comes to the enforcement of legal rights, in that respect, we say it's more important. But even if it comes to the fact of just keeping the money they earn from selling themselves, and we would suggest in that respect it's important they get a legal regime that recognises their right to those profits. But secondly, if you look at the protection of workers in legal regimes,
Please, sir.
that once you legalise it, the social stigma against them disappears. So you can run an effective campaign on sexual health targeted to them specifically. The closing opposition asked a point of information about the sexual health program designed to target sex workers in Thailand. The single biggest reason why that program didn't work was not because the program was poorly designed, but it was because prostitution is illegal in Thailand, and the government couldn't effectively market it to anyone because it had to maintain a particular facade that the law it had on its books was necessarily a good one. The only other thing they could then say with respect to regulation was that somehow others could do it better. Well, we would suggest that if there is a problem of regulation in the developing world, it's always better pursued by that particular government rather than outsourcing it to capricious NGOs and relying on them to fix any social problem. But secondly, with respect to this idea that once prostitution is legalised, you then can't remove it, well, we would suggest the history of first world countries with respect to the legalisation of prostitution is telling in enhancing the regulatory capacity of governments to pick the bits of the sex industry they don't like. Because when these governments are dependent on the economic benefits of prostitutes and dependent on the economic prosperity that brings, they then can't regulate any bits of the industry. And that actually creates the framework whereby, say, child sex tourism is allowed to happen, which we think is a very marginal portion of the total sex industry. Madam.
When you recognise the fact that the type of sex that is the sex tourism industry, not the sex industry, how does your model not force it underground and remove rights and increase
This is
exploitation?
ridiculous. The idea that people come to Thailand only to have sex with children. Madam Speaker, the city of Pattaya stands against that general proposition because we would suggest that if you go to all of these places, they are adults pursuing this particular profession, and the child element of it is a tiny proportion. But moreover, a system whereby you legalise the whole thing actually gives you the framework to deal with that specific bit of the problem. And this brings me to the first point I want to make, how this enhances the institutional capacity of government. Because we say one big problem with governments not investing in sex tourism and not legalising prostitution as a result is the foregone tax revenue that it denies them. A study of sex tourism in Southeast Asia revealed that for countries like Indonesia, Thailand and Malaysia, prostitution accounts for somewhere between 2 and 14% of the GDP. Now the reason why that figure has such big variation within it is because there's a massive underground economy. And to that extent, we think this policy will finally break the connection between organised crime and prostitution, which not only means that these people never get rights, but it facilitates the drug trade, it facilitates child sex trafficking to other jurisdictions. And to that extent, the reason why it's going to do that is very simple. Because a regime where you allow people to apply openly to participate in an economic activity which is recognised as valid, and where there is a market, is always going to attract open, transparent economic actors who are going to do the right thing. But secondly, ladies and gentlemen, we would say recognising the economic reality of the problem, as we've stated a number of times, actually gives you the framework to deal with it. Because if the government relies on the economic benefits of sex within these countries and the ancillary benefits that provides these communities, and that if you have a system whereby they can then recognise and accept that those benefits exist, but they not have to, say, undermine all of the sex industry, it'll give them the power to stamp out things like child sex tourism. The second point I want to make is with respect to the status of women. Because we would suggest that a part of the feminist project, a central tenet, is a recognition that full bodily autonomy is central to any social recognition that a woman is a fully empowered social actor, and that no one has the right to say she can't do what she wants with her own body. That actually not allowing prostitution in this respect is an unjustified interference with the full autonomy of the female body. And that we think a system which promotes prostitution and that actually suggests that it is a valid economic activity is a good one for facilitating a recognition that women enjoy autonomy and full independence as economic and political actors in society. And we think that's why every Western country has legalised prostitution, because it recognises that point. The final point we would make with respect to this, ladies and gentlemen, is that we think that it's in the long-term economic interests of these countries. That is because tourists also are averse to coming to these countries because of the legal framework, which means they might be exploited. And that the ancillary benefits of these people coming and spending huge amounts of money in the city of Pattaya and other countries is actually a hugely important thing because it brings money and creates prosperity. Mr. Speaker, we're more than prepared to tap the sex tourist market.
Thank the member for his speech and invite the member of the opposition to begin the case.
Ladies and gentlemen, the government benches continue to perpetuate a false categorisation of prostitution as something which people do out of choice. In the vast majority of circumstances, and particularly in the developing world, it's an economic imperative which means that young women turn themselves to prostitution. It's that economic imperative which means that sex tourism doesn't take place in Monaco, ladies and gentlemen. It takes place in Thailand and in the Philippines and in Nigeria. And in that sense, the false distinction which this side of the House has been trying to draw between good prostitution and bad prostitution falls away from this debate. We condemn child prostitution because we say there is an unfair balance of power between the buyer and the seller because of a level of knowledge and maturity. We say that same form of analysis can be applied where the wealth associated with the buyer is so much higher than the wealth associated with the seller that in fact you see it is a false choice. This is a choice which happens out of economic necessity. This is not a debate which can be about the economic empowerment of women, because this is a choice that they're making about their body with the gun of poverty against their head, ladies and gentlemen. And even if we do admit that we're giving them some autonomy by being able to make this choice, it's not like the money is going into their pockets, it's going into the pockets of the pimp that sells them on the street, ladies and gentlemen. No thank you. We're yet to hear a realistic analysis from this side of the House as to why this actually benefits the women rather than the system which perpetuates the abrogation of their rights. I'm going to do two things in this debate. The first is to summarise and cover off the first half of the debate by talking about the capacity to regulate, and the second is to look at the extension which the closing opposition which will bring, which is to look at religious and social attitudes in the developing world and how prostitutes are going to not have a very nice time of it, even if prostitution is illegal. So first let's have a look at the capacity to regulate. What we've already told you on this side of the House is that just how at the moment there is currently a market for illegal sex practices, there is nothing to suggest that that market won't continue. And what we say is that as a result of this, you're going to see that, yeah, paedophilia will increase, but it also may be some of those kind of lesser sex crimes, if you like, things which might be more palatable to the Aussie guy who's coming for the stag do, like sex without contraception, or sex with a younger Thai woman who may appear to be, I don't know, 16 or let's say 14, because that's the age of consent in Thailand, but in fact is a little bit younger than that. The second thing that we say in terms of the capacity to regulate, and you're really going to have to excuse this, but we have to talk about the race to the bottom in this scenario, ladies and gentlemen. Because we say if we constitute, in the real world, the most dangerous and worst sex practices will flock to the developing country that is least able to regulate them. So what we say is if Thailand's mechanism is effective for stopping paedophilia, then all the paedophiles are just going to jump over the border into Cambodia, where their gross domestic product is much lower and they have less capacity to engage in the kind of engagement which these guys say. Once you legitimise prostitution as a legal choice, ladies and gentlemen, once you say we're going to do that, the next step is taken by the underground market, the step to acknowledging practices which presumably you didn't want to before. The final point to make in terms of the capacity to regulate, but before that I'll take you, Chris.
So if that was a problem, could you explain why, say, Australia, which has legalised prostitution, doesn't have a big problem with underage sex in the prostitution market?
Well, for a start, it's probably still cheaper for them to go and have legal or illegal sex in Thailand because that's the way the economy works. But the second thing I'll say, and this has happened in Australia and it's happened in New Zealand, you legalise prostitution, you get more of it, ladies and gentlemen. So it's not just the paedophiles we're talking about here, it's also the other people who are making false coerced choices because of their economic situation. They're going to get more of it. We say that that's a bad thing. The final point to make in terms of the capacity to regulate is that in fact Australia can be differentiated from the developing world because these are countries which are not well equipped to in fact engage in regulating the sex industry. And let's remember that this is an industry which we still struggle to regulate in the developed world, which is still typically associated with gangs, still typically associated with pimps, still typically associated with illegal foreign workers who have been people trafficked in. We struggle, and the reason we struggle is because of the decentralisation of the industry. You don't want a lot of people in the room watching what happens, ladies and gentlemen, and so it's difficult to have eyes in every corner. And because of the discretion which is afforded to the various elements down the hierarchy of the sex tourist. The discretion which is afforded to the pimp to say yes or no, I will take on this client without looking at how old she is. Yes or no, I will allow a client to use a condom or not use a condom depending on what's going on. Let's move now to this idea of religion and social attitudes. And you know what? It's already been raised by us in a point of information. We said to Jordan, how do you explain the kind of career prospects which exist for a prostitute in the developed world? He couldn't do that. He sure as hell can't explain it in the developing world either. Because we say, if you legalise prostitution in the Philippines or in Nigeria, it doesn't stop those countries maintaining the same social and religious attitudes towards prostitution that their Catholic or partly Muslim faith requires them to do. We say that the reason, in fact, that people go into prostitution in those countries is because of economic desperation, and frankly, the only way for them to get out of that desperation is to continue being prostitutes overseas. So in fact, what we see is that perpetuating these cycles of sex tourism are likely to increase people trafficking because there's going to be more and more prostitutes on the street who realise the only opportunity for them essentially to get ahead in this world is to leave the country that they're in. The second thing that we say is just because you change a law, it may mean that the young woman who's moved to the city in search of economic opportunity but hasn't found any is more inclined to go into prostitution. But it doesn't necessarily mean that her family back home in the rural areas of Nigeria is going to concur with her decision. So we say when she gets a sexually transmitted disease, she's not going to go back and find solace in the community that sent her into work for the sake of economic prosperity. When she finds herself pregnant, ladies and gentlemen, she's more likely to turn to a backstreet abortion if she's likely to have an abortion at all, or she's more likely to be a pariah into the community into which she returns. Essentially what we say is you're going to see a distinction between the religious attitudes of the communities from which prostitutes come and the decisions which they make motivated by short-term economic gain. Again, we come back to the point which I made at the beginning of my speech. The suggestion on this side of the house that this is a choice which they're affording to women to allow them to be empowered and participate in society in the context of the developing world is essentially false. Their decisions are motivated by an economic imperative. It's an economic imperative which may lead them to get a short-term gain at a very significant long-term cost. They can't develop their career, they can't go back to their communities, they can't seek support when things happen to them. For all those reasons, we proudly oppose.
Thank the member for her speech and invite the whip to conclude the case for government benches.
Thanks very much, Mr. Speaker, ladies and gentlemen. The unfortunate reality in today's debate is that this was never a choice between no sex tourism and no prostitution versus sex tourism and prostitution. This was a choice between ongoing, dangerous, unregulated sex tourism where the participants keep none of the profits and have no legal rights versus a system of safe, regulated sex tourism where the participants keep the profits, have legal rights, and the government can then go about using the profits that they get in tax revenue to bolster the very institutions that are used to protect those people. In Australia, we call that a no-brainer of a choice, and we're happy to run with that eloquent debating expression as it is. I'd like to look at three things in my speech. Firstly, protection and the capacity to regulate, looking particularly at where our material in our extension took that particular argument and where it was not picked up by the closing half of the opposition benches. I'd then like to look at the notion of rights and empowerment and how poverty affects rights, as we just heard, and thirdly, the idea of economic development as an end in and of itself. Firstly, to protection. Said from the word go, no thank you, sir, that a system of legalized prostitution and sex tourism increases the will and the capacity to fight the elements of the sex trade that we don't want. In fact, it's the best way to fight the bad sex that the opposition wanted to talk about. And what did they say about bad sex? They said that if you legalise it, all the bad stuff that happens, conceding there that there is plenty of sex tourism that they don't particularly have a problem with, but the really bad stuff, like child sex and razor blade sex or whatever else happens at Macquarie University, is going to be involved. We've got 4 reasons why our model is better for the rights of sex workers and why it doesn't increase bad sex. Firstly, because as we said, the status quo is the system that supports the prevalence of those things. But secondly, it's not a lack of institutional capacity that stops people from regulating. It's a lack of political will. As Chris noted, when 14% of your GDP is reliant on the sex industry and you say it's all illegal, then you can't crack down on any of it because you rely on the profits from the whole sex industry. It's an important part of the economy. But what you do when you say that actually there's part of the sex industry that will keep the profits and will keep the people in that industry making money is it licenses the government. It removes the institutional excuse to not crack down on sex because the money element of it that caused the government to turn a blind eye is protected. And we talked about that in our extension and it just wasn't sufficiently dealt with by the closing opposition. The third reason is that the dollars you get in tax allows you to spend it on bolstering the institutions that you use. And the fourth reason is simply an evidence one. At the moment, the biggest problem with child sex and those kinds of things isn't that everyone uses it. The biggest problem is that no one reports it because as soon as you report sex, people ask, why were you at a brothel? And then you're guilty of a crime. But what you do when you create legal frameworks is people in the industry and users of the industry are then licensed to report bad things in the industry because it's not an automatic go to jail card for them if they do. So I think that's 4 pretty compelling reasons, take them one sec, 4 pretty compelling reasons why this will protect people more. So,
and you recognise there's always going to be an economic incentive for the poor market, the razor blade market, because it pertains specifically to sex tourism, not the industry development itself.
Thanks.
How do you protect people
Thanks,
from
Lee.
that?
Firstly, we don't think that foreign equals filthy, and we don't think that sex tourists come to a country like Thailand just because they want to have dirty sorts of sex. You closing half said it themselves. It's actually cheaper to get regular prostitute sex by coming to Thailand than it is in your home country, which explains the large push to tourism. The other point we said about protection, by the way, frustratingly unresponded to by the closing opposition, is when it comes to protection, this actually breaks the nexus between prostitution and organised crime in general. It stops the fact that prostitutes and that pimps of prostitutes use that money to fund sex trafficking to the first world. They use it to they use it for people smuggling, and they use the profits for drug dealing and drug smuggling. So we think that breaking that nexus is a powerful form of protection too. The second area I'd like to deal with is rights. We said in our extension that this is fundamentally about personal autonomy and choice. And the compelling analysis that we heard from the closing opposition benches was, well, when you're poor, often you're forced into making choices that aren't real choices. Well, duh! Like, the unfortunate and tragic reality of being poor is that your choices are limited. But we don't say, well, we're just not going to let you choose any job at all, even one that will feed your starving family, because we have a moral objection to sex. That's absurd. No, thank you. And the reason we don't do it is that because they're poor and have no options and they're desperate, is they will do it anyway. They will still make the choice. Hence the fact that prostitution is presently illegal and the largest sex trade in the world is in the country. So really, we're not helping them not make the choice, we're just forcing them into a dangerous, unsafe choice where they have no money from it. And that's the final reason that we don't think this is supporting of rights, is they keep saying it's not a path out of poverty. That's bollocks. If there's one thing microcredit has taught us, and this is actually true, if there's one thing microcredit has taught us, it's in poor countries, the biggest thing out of poverty, the biggest thing to getting out of poverty is the first couple of dollars. It's earning a bit of money so you can buy things to put on a shopping cart and sell them. So you can buy tire tubing and start repairing tires. And in the same way that microcredit develops poor economies. Prostitution in economies where you don't have to earn a lot of money hugely empowers, taking that step, hugely empowers people to take that step out of poverty in a way that they don't in a first world economy.
So how can you argue that governments will regulate poor practice more effectively when it starts collecting taxation revenue from poor practice?
Well, it doesn't collect it from poor practice because poor practice is illegal. That was the whole point from the opening government, is that the reason you do it is so you have an institutional excuse, as we said, an institutional excuse to crack down on parts of the sex trade without cracking down on a whole industry that your economy is reliant on. So the final point really in the debate is one about economic development. I've already dealt with the idea that on an individual level, this empowers people because they get to get the profits. But as Chris mentioned, economies are reliant on this. Opening opposition want to hide behind, the convenient ethical line of we don't like the idea that countries will make money off people selling their bodies. Well, honestly, neither do I personally, really, but unfortunately in the developing world, that's just not a choice we can make. And if it can be done safely, if people can do it in a way that's safe, if governments can regulate it, which we've proven they have the institutional capacity and the money to do under our model, then if people don't have an ethical problem with it, we have no problem with people making that choice. For all those reasons, we are very, very proud to propose this motion.
I thank the whip and invite the government whip to conclude the debate.
Ladies and gentlemen, I want to analyse this debate in two key areas. Firstly, the effects that women on women, ladies and gentlemen, the effects on prostitutes, which is obviously dominated the majority of this debate today. And secondly, I want to have a look at what the government proposal would do in terms of poverty, in terms of development. Those are the two key areas, ladies and gentlemen, in which I have questions. My first question is, do the benefits that the government has tried to point you to today, do they exist, will they eventuate? And the second question is, ladies and gentlemen, is that will the detriments which the opposition has pointed you to today, will they outweigh those? And we say, ladies and gentlemen, absolutely yes they will. Let's analyse first, ladies and gentlemen, the effects that the government's proposition would have on prostitutes and on women in particular. And I'd like to look at two key areas. Firstly, the idea of empowerment, ladies and gentlemen, which has been a kind of a key point which has been raised. The first link that needs to be made is that by making something legal, you make it acceptable. You take away the stigma, ladies and gentlemen. We say, quite frankly, nowhere along the government benches have they been able to prove this link. Nowhere, ladies and gentlemen, have they been able to show you that just because you've made something legal, you've now made it acceptable for women to do, you've now given them an opportunity to be empowered. We say, ladies and gentlemen, that that link, which has just been, no thank you, just been asserted down the government lines, doesn't exist. We say, ladies and gentlemen, that the idea that was brought out by closing government, which is that once you legalise, the stigma disappears, we say simply doesn't occur. All you need to do, ladies and gentlemen, is look at the kind of stigma that's attached to prostitutes in the West in order to show you that this is simply the case. The next point, ladies and gentlemen, that comes under the idea of empowerment for women is the feminist perspective that was brought out by closing government. They say, ladies and gentlemen, this is a great idea because it gives women bodily autonomy from a feminist perspective, and it's great because therefore we're making leaps forward in terms of feminist movements. We say, ladies and gentlemen, that advocating a business in which males are dominant and in which they continuously subject women to kind of sexual practices and use their bodies in a way that's far from bodily autonomy, ladies and gentlemen. We say that this kind of feminist critique of the whole thing is quite frankly laughable. No, thank you, sit down. So we say, ladies and gentlemen, that in terms of empowerment of women, the kind of theoretical, airy-fairy elements of this debate, we say that quite frankly, advocating an industry in which women's bodies are used for sex and used for money doesn't go very far towards empowerment whatsoever. No thanks. Let's move on now, ladies and gentlemen, and have a look at the idea of safety and more kind of practical elements of this debate. The first point that I want to make under this is the kind of link between legalising of prostitution and investment in sex industry and the reduction of exploitative sex, the reduction of child sex in particular. We say, ladies and gentlemen, that the more you try and regulate an industry, particularly, well, the sex industry in particular, the more you try and invest in it, the more you try and fund in it, the demand still exists. We say, ladies and gentlemen, that it is simply not true to say that all sex tourists are just happy Australians coming over here for stag nights, ladies and gentlemen. We say that worryingly, child sex across the world is absolutely horrific. And that demand, ladies and gentlemen, is not going away. Nowhere down the line have they been able to try and show you that by some reason the demand goes away. What we say, ladies and gentlemen, is that there are therefore two results of this, which we say is actually very negative given the government's proposition. The first is that within the country itself, ladies and gentlemen, we say that it becomes harder and harder to regulate, say, child sex, as people take more and more extreme measures to meet the demand, yet at the same time get around the kind of government regulations which have been proposed. We say that that's the first thing. The second point is, ladies and gentlemen, which was raised by Joe and has never really been adequately responded to, is the idea of the race to the bottom. We say, ladies and gentlemen, that even if within a particular country you do make really good crackdowns on child sex or sex without a condom, no thank you. We say that simply having other countries, therefore, who don't have such good regulations, who don't have the same kind of regulations as you do, ladies and gentlemen, we say that instead of reducing it, you're simply moving it. And so for those reasons, ladies and gentlemen, we say that the idea that their proposition makes the whole world and the sex industry safer is not true at all. We say also, ladies and gentlemen, that for the women in the room, in terms of safety, we say that the kind of financial imperative under which they're operating makes it very, very likely that when they see a US greenback, the idea for them, no thank you, sit down, to have sex without a condom increases, ladies and gentlemen. The possibility and the kind of incentives for them to participate in unsafe practices, regardless of whether or not you invest in sex tourism, ladies and gentlemen, we say still exists, and therefore it doesn't make the industry safer for women and safer for prostitutes. The idea, ladies and gentlemen, again, in terms of the gang environment, which was brought up by the closing government, that at the end of the day, you're still not removing this kind of influence. It's still going to be cheaper, ladies and gentlemen, to do it in an unregulated industry. Off the street, ladies and gentlemen, for example, it's still cheaper to buy counterfeit DVDs from the Cowsand Road Market than it is from my local DVD store. And we say, so as a result, you're not taking away the kind of gang influence which the closing government has really wanted to do. No thanks, sit down. Then, ladies and gentlemen, let's move on now and finally have a look at the idea of poverty and development. The first one is the idea of a false choice, which was brought up for you by Joe. The idea is here, ladies and gentlemen, that these women are not making the kind of choice which we would kind of advocate for them to do. And just before I carry over that point, yes, sir.
So can you just outline under your system exactly what these women will choose to do instead in order to drive themselves out of poverty?
We say, sir, that particular, the specificity of what they're going to be doing is not what we're here to be talking about. What we are here to be talking about, ladies and gentlemen, is trying to disincentivize them from making a kind of false, desperate choice into a sex industry, ladies and gentlemen, where they stand the chance of being exploited and where they stand the chance of having to be forced into participating in unsafe sex practices. So we say, ladies and gentlemen, that the idea of forcing them into making this choice, the false choice idea, which Joe brought out to you, is one that we don't want to try and incentivize. We don't want to make that choice seem more appealing for them, particularly when government sends signals which say the sex industry is okay. Moreover, ladies and gentlemen, then let's move on and have a look at the idea of the steady stream of income, the development point, ladies and gentlemen, which has been brought out by the government teams. We say that, first of all, we're still operating through a system of PIPs. We're still operating through a system of gangs, ladies and gentlemen. The type of steady income which the government has tried to point you to is not necessarily going to be as steady as they think. Moreover, we think, ladies and gentlemen, that there's no social mobility. There's no ability for them to progress, ladies and gentlemen. There's no ability for them to carry on up the development scale if they're simply locked into a life cycle of poverty the whole time. We say that when you consider these sorts of factors against the kind of dire consequences which we've pointed you to, in terms of being ostracised from their villages, from their communities, from their normal beliefs, and the kind of things like abortions, ladies and gentlemen, and STIs, which come as a result, we see that the government's proposition here today cannot be stomached. Thank you.
With all the speakers invite you to cross the floor, shake hands.